So welcome to our Alum Fellows reading series. Our guest speaker, Myisha Cherry, is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and her research lies at the intersection of moral psychology and social and political philosophy. She's particularly interested in the role of emotions and attitudes in public life. Her books include The Moral Psychology of Anger, co-edited with Owen Flanagan, and UnMuted Conversations on Prejudice, Oppression, and Social Justice. Her next book on anger and the anti-racist struggle is under contract with Oxford University Press, and after a 10-way auction, Princeton University Press has won North American rights to her book, The Failures of Forgiveness, and that is to be on the shelves in 2023. Myisha Cherry has authored numerous articles on emotions and race in top academic journals in her fields. In addition, she has written on political emotions, race, and justice for such publications as the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Review, New Philosopher, and Womankind. She is also the host of the popular UnMuted podcast, where she interviews philosophers about the social and political issues of our day. She will be in discussion today with the wonderful Todney Thomas. Todney Thomas is a sociocultural anthropologist and assistant professor of African American religions at Harvard Divinity School. Her latest book, Kincraft, The Making of Black Evangelical Sociality, is forthcoming in the spring from Duke University Press. Would you like to start, Myisha?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much. When I got Krishna's invite in my inbox, I was so happy. I have a special love for the Hutchins Center. As this series indicates, I'm a fellow for life. I'm a fellow. And interestingly, I was a fellow as a grad student. And that time that I spent at the Hutchins Center was so developmental. The time that I spent at Harvard has really helped me as I'm becoming the scholar that I want to be. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of have a reunion of sorts with the Hutchins Center. And thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for joining in. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. But this book is interesting. It's quite different from a typical manuscript. As Krishna kind of indicated, I'm a host of a podcast, and it's called the UnMuted Podcast. It was started about 5 years ago. And the purpose of the podcast was to kind of bring attention to social and political philosophy, a lot of conversations and interesting topics and research that was being done in that particular area. I felt that it shouldn't be limited to just the ivory tower, but I felt like the conversations that I was reading or the material that I was reading in academic journals had import for the world. And so I wanted to talk to these wonderful philosophers about their ideas and share that conversation with others. And so this book originated, I think, after the third season of the podcast. In some ways, I felt that the podcast could be much more accessible. And I felt that there were some people who hadn't heard of the podcast, some people who were hearing impaired that couldn't hear the podcast. And I felt that another form was important. And so that was the whole purpose of the book. In the book, I have conversations with 33 philosophers about a variety of conversations about a variety of topics. And I'm going to read an excerpt from the concluding section of the book called A Note on Conversations. And then we're going to get into a conversation with Dr. Thomas. Conversations are hard to have. Imagine the feeling you get in your gut when someone says to you, "We need to talk." The words sound like an indictment. Immediately, you feel transported into a dark room, cramped room, with one dim light and 100 possibilities in your head for why this person needs to converse with you. Your thoughts race and your heart thumps, jumps, and refuses to calm down until the person explains what's on their mind. The longer you have to wait, the more intense the pain. Why am I in trouble, you wonder? Needing to have a conversation signals a serious situation. You could have gotten the silent treatment. They could have gotten over it. But no, your feelings are so great that only a conversation would do. Initiating a conversation is not easy either. When you're the one to confront someone and make them sit down with you to have a serious talk, You risk being perceived as irrational, sensitive, or insecure. I feel statements are supposed to make your conversation partner lower their defenses, but they can expose you and make you feel dangerously vulnerable in the process. Who knows how it will all turn out anyway? You may spark the conversation in hope of being understood or resolving an issue, only to be dismissed or ignored in the end. Then there's the conversation that springs forth somehow unexpectedly from our everyday interactions with each other. No one in the group is in trouble, at least not initially. A gathering that was meant to celebrate Kareem's engagement or Fauza's birthday can easily turn into a panel discussion about Palestine, Black Lives Matter, heteronormativity, or healthcare. Do we participate or exit? Do we hold back or speak our minds? If we do share what we think, how much can we say? How far can we go? And at what cost will it be to our friendships, social calendars, and overall flourishing? Having conversations is a way for our social linguistic species to express and explain, correct and collaborate, make sense of things, and make things happen. Anything that can do all of these things will never be easy. What if I told you that conversations are not our most pressing problem? The problem is who we are in our conversations. Despite our differences with each other, we are often, like Socrates, not the kind of person with whom others can or would want to have conversations. We cannot isolate conversations and their content from the people who engage in them. It's hard to digest advice from a hypocrite, share with someone who makes you feel insignificant, or correct someone who thinks he knows it all. This is because character matters in our conversations. And I believe if we aim to be a certain kind of conversation partner by exercising particular virtues, our conversations will be better regardless of the topic or the disagreement. Epistemologists and ethicists have offered up insights on virtues we can have as knowers and moral creatures. I do not profess to add anything novel to their contribution, so I will only appropriate them for our purposes here. But together they remind us of the beauty of traits like humility, sincerity, and tactfulness. These character traits are conversation starters in that they allow us to be the kind of persons others can begin and continue to converse with. I note in brief just a few here to convey my point, and I leave it up to you to add others to the list. Humility is when a person recognizes their epistemic limitations. A person who has conversation humility can admit that they do not know it all. They have what philosopher Jose Medina calls a humble and self-questioning attitude. Those who are humble are not self-righteous. They recognize that at any moment, anyone, including themselves, could be wrong. Curiosity is an interest and willingness to know. People who are curious have a motivation to gain knowledge, and it doesn't matter from what body that knowledge reveals itself. They are not naive. They're simply indiscriminate in whom they talk to, believing that anyone is bound to teach them something. Being diligent helps a person keep their curiosity in times in which dialogue with others is either shut down or difficult to have. A person who is open-minded acknowledges and respects alternative perspectives. Being open-minded entails being willing to consider new ideas. Open-minded conversationalists are not quick to reject what others have to say. They're likely to see the beauty in disagreement. This eye allows them to be more accepting and less controlling. More courage is the fortitude to move beyond one's comfort zone. A person who is courageous faces the fear of the unknown. She is also willing to face criticism or misunderstanding. She knows that this is often the risk one takes when talking with others. When a person is sincere in a conversation, she is herself. She's not playing a character in order to get approval. Sincere conversations do not come to conversations with ulterior motives or masked as something more accepting. They are unpretentious. Conversation partners who are generous are not quick to judge or speak. They are willing to give their partner the benefit of the doubt. They are not so enamored by their own voice that they never let others share. A generous person is often quite patient. When talking with them, others often feel that they can be heard and finish a sentence without being interrupted with the famous or the infamous preface, not to cut you off, but patient conversationalists do not think that their thoughts are more important than the thoughts presently being spoken by others. Therefore, they often wait their turn. Their patience also helps them keep their composure when others are not as virtuous. Tactful people are experts in tonality and linguistics. They know what to say, how to say it, and what context to say it in. They do not force others to always have thick skin when talking with them. Tactful conversationalists do not allow their vices to drive the bus. And so it is rare that they justify their tactlessness with "I'm just keeping it real" or "this is who I am." We can add other virtues to this list, such as honesty, discretion, security, and self-awareness. As I've mentioned, the list is not exhaustive. There's an assortment of virtues waiting for us to put in practice. I've tried to practice these virtues in the conversations in this book, but I've also been challenged to be and do better beyond academic discourses. Here are some questions I am constantly asking myself. How can I extend the same curiosity and humility to ordinary folks on Main Street that I have shown to professors on College Road? How can I have the same moral courage in conversations with my friends, peers, or supervisors as when I have conversations with academics when there's everything at stake, just as much when there's very little at stake? How can I be more sincere and honest when I stand to lose so much? How can I be less defensive and more self-aware when the people I care about muster up the courage to say to me that we need to talk? Socrates was right. The unexamined life is not worth living. Let me offer a word of caution. In our technological age, we use text, audio messaging, live video chats, and social media and Zoom as ways to engage in conversations. There's no need for us to wait until we are in the same city or even know each other's real name to converse. But the very innovations that facilitate our exchanges can also distort the aforementioned virtues and thus disrupt our conversations. People can mistake the tone of our text, misinterpreting what was intended as a kind response as a mean rant. Our dismissive zingers and not our open-minded replies are often rewarded with likes and follows, and our brains recognize this. It's hard to practice courage when death threat to loom in your Twitter mentions and the internet never forgets. While social media brings so many advantages, if I never have to be in your presence or know you to talk with you, then some might ask, what do I owe you or myself when we engage in discussion? Even if we are able to jump over these technological hurdles and see the virtues of others, I cannot guarantee that conversations will be instantly easy. It is hard enough to talk about moral and political issues. Topics like prejudice, oppression, and social justice are the elephants in the room. They are what many people think about, but few dare to discuss. Some topics are hard to talk about because we have prolonged the conversation for so long. They can implicate us or obligate us to do something we probably do not want to do. I don't think talking about controversial topics will undermine our democracy. Yes, conversations are hard, but they can be had if only we weren't so hardened. By saying that we have to practice virtues and improve our character in order to improve our conversations, I don't mean to say that only perfect people have what it takes to be worthy conversation partners. What I'm claiming is that we cannot separate conversations from the people that engage in them. Be the person that you want to have a conversation with. This has nothing to do with being smart, progressive, or right. It has everything to do with being a person with a character that makes conversing a human experience for the people on both sides.
So, thank you for that introduction. It's an honor to be here and to ECU and converse with you. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Not to be too ethnographic,
Okay.
but there's something about reading your introduction, your conclusion, reading some of the interviews. I looked at the race and economics section that strikes me as somewhat ethnographic, right? And that is that there's a way in which anthropologists don't generate text without conversation, right? And so I do have questions about method, and it strikes me that the ending of your book talks about a kind of method or ethics for conversation. You started at the beginning by talking about the motivation for your work, that you wanted to expand your audience, right? That you wanted this sort of some of the academic philosophical conversations that you felt were relevant, that had broader purchase to be available beyond the ivory tower. Who is or who has been your target audience for your UnMuted podcast and for this book?
Yeah, target audience. So I'm gonna say everyone. Okay,
everyone,
right?
Everybody.
Broad, right? That's pretty broad. That's pretty broad. But here's the reason why I say everyone. Because we're all faced with these issues that I'm trying to get us to talk about more widely. And that's one of the motivations, right? So if I'm spending 6 months to craft an article, right? My original intent, first of all, maybe to get tenure, but my second intent may be to kind of be in conversation with these other philosophers who's also thought about these particular issues, right? And then what I do is what we think we're doing is contributing to kind of a kind of a subdiscipline within our general discipline or within our general field, right? That at least is the mindset of the academic, but I want to say that's the narrow mindset of the academic, particularly from a philosophical perspective. I am a professional philosopher, but I think all of us are doing philosophy, right? And so as much as it may take me 6 months to think about an issue, I'm pretty sure a child has solved this problem in 2 weeks, right? So I think everyone is engaging in these issues. Everyone is asking these particular questions. And if everyone is engaging in these issues and asking these particular questions, then I think what the podcast is trying to do is to engage with those folk, whether those people are trying to answering the questions in quite completely different ways that are in contrast to our particular answers. But I think we live in a world that's full of injustice. Whether we are on one side as opposed to the other, we are all engaging not only in the practice but also in the philosophy of these particular things. And so my target audience are those folks, which is everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah. Now whether I reach that target is another thing. But I am thinking about everyone. I'm thinking about the public in a very general sense as the public. Yeah.
So, when you start a new endeavor, right, a new podcast, a new project, you have, that sort of center, right, the central thing that motivates you. Have your motivations for UnMuted changed over time?
Yeah. So originally, and I don't know if I think I mentioned this in the introduction. So I come from a particular background that is not academic. Family didn't go to college. First person to go to college, get a PhD, whatever. Also come from a context in which being an activist, being part of organizations, being part of church communities is just very important. And so when I decided to kind of go full time in this thing, and even before I decided to go back and get my PhD, I was heavily involved in the nonprofit sector. And so what I had to do with reconciling is that I wanted to make sure that if I'm going to do this thing, as far as the PhD is concerned, I got to have my foot in both places, right? Not only because I think that's just who I am, but who I am has a lot to do with how I was raised and what and those have an effect on who my audience is, what my more obligation, those folk, my more obligation is to. And so even the work that I do beyond the podcast, even the most strict academic work, my hope is that my sister can read the work. So it is this kind of this this professional obligation that I have, but also what I consider kind of a moral and political obligation that I have, is that the questions or the kind of work that I'm doing in this space, that other people can understand it. Because it has this, as I've mentioned before, it has this import to those other kinds of worlds. And so my vocation is not strictly an academic vocation. It's a vocation that reached beyond a campus community. And so when I was thinking about the podcast, I was thinking about those folks. My obligation was pulling like, yes, I'm doing this because I started the podcast as a graduate student. So yes, I'm taking these classes and doing these courses. I'm all the way in Chicago at the time. And then I moved to Boston. I'm far away from my family in Mississippi. I'm far away from my cousins in Virginia, but I don't want to be that far. And so how can I stay connected to a lot of quote unquote clients or people that I interacted with in the nonprofit sector when I was in New York City? I constantly think about them a lot. And so that was kind of the original basis. And they still are, as much as everyone seems abstract, I do think about them. My former students, formerly incarcerated students, they come to my mind. I give them a shout out in the book. They come to my mind when I'm doing this particular work. So that was, those people and that moral obligation, that connection that I still feel to community, that's way beyond academic. It's always my motivation and was my original motivation for the project.
Okay. So, you have this, desire to reach a broader public. There are these current conversations that need a broader say beyond the academy. And you've given us a bit of an autoethnography, right? About pathway into the academy, right? And a pathway that's about not leaving people behind, right? It's about really sort of knitting your worlds together, right? The worlds that
I would say, not just leaving them around, but trying to catch up. Because I think, and I don't know about your field, I think philosophy is behind on a lot of stuff. I think a lot of questions that we're trying to answer has already been answered by activists and journalists, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just trying to catch up to them and be in conversation to them. But I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really beautiful transition into my next question, which is about what does public philosophy look like, right? So, you're talking about the people who are ahead. One of the reasons I became an anthropologist is because I wanted to show the genius of Black folk, that everyday people are theorists, right? And that they have important questions, important thoughts on some of our most important questions: the barbershop, the pews, the reception, fellowship halls, and the kitchens where church women are. I've got some of my best life lessons and takes on this country. What in your experience or even your imagination should or does public philosophy look like?
I think it can look like a variety of things, right? And it goes back to the abstract public, right? There are there's publics within the public. And I think it's going to look different depending on who your public is, right? And so for the podcast, my public was those who could hear. And that's going to look totally different. What's needed to do that technologically is totally different than what's needed to put that in a book.
Right.
So it's going to look differently. I mean, so not only do I have the podcast, and this is just giving you an example of what it can look like. I don't necessarily think that I have an account of what it should look like. But I can only say what I've been trying to do. So we have the podcast, which is very audio wise. The book is something that people can hold on to. And then I just recently wrote an article for The Atlantic. And so people who've never heard the podcast, never really picked up the book. Immediately I got emails from exes who read the Atlantic article. And we were able to have a conversation about anger. That's a story for another time when this Zoom is over. So yeah, the Atlantic, and then giving public talks to different very venues. Like I've given a talk at a synagogue, which they've probably never seen a Black woman with dreads enter that particular space. So I think it can look. There's a variety of ways in which it can look. I mean, I know other people have decided to go the documentary route. So I think there's a lot of ways in which you think about The Good Place, for example. I think it's a good example of public philosophy, although it's entertainment. Shout out to Chidi. I mean, it's a good example of public philosophy.
Yeah.
And yes, there are many Black Jews, but the particular synagogue that I was referring to is mostly, yes, non-Black Jews. Yes, I think it can look, here's the thing. I think what we need to begin to see is the possibilities, that there are many possibilities to take our work from the academy or to share our work or to invite people to the academy. There's a lot of possibilities. And the question is, are we willing to do that kind of work?
Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate that the tenure system doesn't reward it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have to try to figure out, particularly when we're on that track, to figure out where to put our energies at. Right. But I've decided for myself, as for me and my house, I'm committed to the vocation. Mm-hmm. And I think things will work itself out and the rewards will come if I'm committed and consistent to that vocation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to move into discussing some of the content, right? The meat, and potatoes, tofu, and potatoes, sections of the book. Can you tell us a little bit about the types of conversations that are represented in the volume? And something I was just really curious about, what was your most enjoyable conversation?
You want to get me in trouble.
And what was your most challenging conversation?
Okay. So for those who do not have the book is divided into several categories. This is more of an objective thing that I can say at this point. So it's divided into politics and society, kind of in that section. I have conversations on prisons, have conversations on immigration and political representation. Then there's another chapter on language, knowledge, and power. And so have the opportunity to talk to a philosopher about police and their use of language. Mm-hmm. Also had the opportunity to talk about slurs and racial humor. And then there's a section on social groups and activism. So we talk about kind of what does a cross-border feminist solidarity look like. Right. Also have a conversation on disability, a conversation on allies and ally culture. As you mentioned, the section on race and economics. So there's a chapter where we talk about kind of the future of whiteness. Talk about with Tommy Shelby from Harvard about dark ghettos. A very interesting conversation with David McClain on money and materialism. Mm-hmm. Then we have a section on gender, sex, and love where I talk about pornography and homosexuality and non-monogamy. And then we end the book with a section on emotions and art and public life. So a very interesting conversation on Black aesthetics, kind of the power of literature, particularly Black literature, and also a conversation on hope. So you want me to tell you my most difficult conversation and my favorite conversation. Let me start with
it could be enjoyable. I know, it's like doing interviews. Like you don't want to rank them or you don't,
right.
They're associated with people. So,
So I'm going to, this way I can answer, give a shout out to two individuals. So I think what I found was probably the most enlightening for me at the time. And this goes back to the section on social groups and activism. Was two conversations that I had about disability. So one conversation with Joel Michael Reynolds on disability. And then I had a conversation with philosopher Elizabeth Barnes, who wrote a book called The Minority Body, which is also about disability. Now, both of these individuals are unique. Joel Michael Reynolds, he had a brother who was disabled and whose mother became disabled later on in her life. And then Elizabeth Barnes, who has a disability, and it has become more, I guess you can say, visually noticeable as the years have progressed. And I went into these conversations without really reading anything on disability. My mother was also disabled. And so I had an experience of what it was like to live with someone who was disabled all of her life. And my mother was physically handicapped. So she was in a wheelchair all of her life. And so I had experiences with a thing. And not just experiences, emotions with a thing. And I think I as a result, I look at the world differently because of that thing. Mm-hmm. But then enter into kind of a conversation with these people who have really not only lived this thing, but thought about it really intensely, much more than I have. They illuminated a lot of things that I didn't have the language for. A lot of things that I couldn't make sense of. even a lot of failures that I was making, they were able to point out to why they were particular failures. So one particular failure, I mean, one of the things that Joel Michael Reynolds talk about is kind of a porn of sorts that we make of people with disability. Inspiration porn, I think is his terminology for it. And so he points out, you know, we see these videos and, you know, people who have a disability are doing CrossFit and we get inspired by it. And he says, what is the basis of that, right? The inspiration kind of stems from this notion that their bodies don't belong in this space, or it kind of denormalizes them in a particular way. And so it was just illuminating for so many different reasons. The most difficult, this is tough. All right, this is one that comes to mind. David McLean on money and materialism. You know, it's tough when you talk about money. I mean, money is always kind of a sensitive topic, but I think it gets more sensitive. I think one of the questions that I asked him is about, you know, what do you feel about the Black community and being seen as materialistic? You know, how do we make sense of that outward kind of view about that? And is there a kind of an immoral kind of diagnosis in that particular thing? And it was a very difficult conversation to have, particularly because it's money, but when it begins to talk about Black folks and the perceptions of Black folks and his recommendations, I mean, that was just a difficult kind of conversation to have. And not everything that I didn't agree with everything. But I like that. I like not agreeing with everything. But that was one of the conversations where I was sweaty during an interview, very concerned about how it was going to be perceived by others, because the topic itself is also just makes you sweat, even when you're thinking about it for yourself as a Black person. So yeah, those are the conversations that stand out for me.
Thanks for sharing that. I want to talk a little bit just about this sort of crown of an ending that you give us in your conclusion, where, you know, you talk about humility, sincerity, and tactfulness, right? And it's sort of almost like a how-to. It's a conversational ethics, you know, and, you know, sort of how to wade into conversation, or best practices, or how to engage in conversation with folk. And I thought about these three ethics, right? Humility, sincerity, tactfulness, right, as a kind of conversational method, versus some of the other work that you do, right? You write a lot about anger, the productive use of anger, right? And I'm also thinking about the politics of refusal, right? Which has become, I think, really a kind of thickened discourse within certain fields of critical study, right? And so, and the politics of non-engagement. And I think that even doing field work around church arson, there's sort of this interesting generational, I don't know if it's a divide, but it's narrated by people as being a generational divide, right? That some of these young people, they don't know how to talk to people, they don't know how to be civil, they don't know how to participate in public discourse. So how do you reconcile these ethics, right, to different kinds of posturing, right? Different, I think, public ethics or ethics for public engagement that exists within some of the fields that you're located in, or sort of contemporary fields, critical fields that your work is adjacent to.
Right. So I guess I would say this: not everything deserves a conversation. So there are just some things that I don't think I need to talk with you about. And so if the issue is my own humanity, we don't need to talk about that, right? I have nothing to add or to say, right? Nor do I want to hear how you disagree and why.
No,
you disagree, right?
No.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So some things are just, you know, for issues of self-respect, communal respect, moral dignity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also, I think, I mean, I want to kind of employ Aristotle here to say that there's, you know, a right way to do it to a certain kind of degree. and right people, right? There's a lot of things that go into this thing when we're talking about virtue. Virtue is about
light.
I know. But to use it in a very strict way here when he talks about virtues, right? Virtues is, hey, I have this, it's the mean between two extremes, right? But it's not only the mean between two extremes, it's the right, right people at the right time, right? And if the time is, if the time is not the right time, then the virtue is not really going to manifest itself, right? So it goes back to what I was talking about as far as some conversations I don't need to be had. So me practicing humility in that context won't be a virtue, it would be a vice.
Right.
Because there's just some kind of claims on my life that I ought not to respond to with humility. Right. So I would say, going back to your question, more of a kind of a concrete example about young folk, and since I work on anger, so there's a lot of things popping in my mind right now. So here's also, I think that I can be angry and still have a conversation with you. Right. So I don't think that the presence of anger impedes on any kind of public discourse as far as fair notions of civility is concerned. So I just want to put that out there. But I also think it goes back to the right time, to the right degree. I think that there are some conversations that don't require conservative notions of civility. And if you bring conservative notions of civility to that conversation, it becomes a vice in that particular perspective. But then I also want to say that, one of the things I was very sensitive with in the concluding chapter is the kind of conversations that I think comes to mind, particularly in our political climate, are these people who totally disagree with us, right? So I'm not saying that you were thinking of this, but we're thinking about public discourse. As a Black person, I'm thinking about someone who utters all lives matter, right? Complete opposite on the end of the spectrum. And you guys need to sit down and have a conversation. Right. And I want to say that, yes, that's difficult. Yes, that also has its problem. But what also has another problem? When you and I have to talk about something. So we're very aligned politically, very aligned educationally. Our values are very much in line. But you said this one thing, right? So it's easy to talk about that extreme case. But what am I bringing to when we have to sit down? Right. So I'm very much concerned about that particular context as well. But for those who are judging young folks about the kind of discourses that they're having and them not being civil, I think they need to also look at them in a more kind of Aristotelian kind of perspective. And I just think that not every conversation or every instance in which we think a conversation can be had requires the same kinds or amounts of virtues. There are just some conversations that don't deserve civility. And you will be responding in a virtuous way as a result of that.
Right. Thank you. I'm thinking now about like hopes and dreams, right? Sort of my new take to some.
What makes you think about hopes and dreams?
Hopes and dreams. Listen, why not hope and dream right now?
Okay.
Like, why not? Why not hope and dream right now? And so I'm thinking about the future directions of UnMuted, right? If you could think about some of the seasons that you're cooking up, if you could think about what volume 2 of UnMuted would include, if you could think about the most, I want you to be ambitious in the dreaming, right? Like I want you to be as capacious, as unobservant of potential limitations as possible. What conversations would you like to have for upcoming seasons for volume 2, right? Are we sticking with philosophy? Are we branching out? Are we, do we have a Black feminist philosophy volume? Like, what's your dream? What's your vision? Your most ambitious set of dreams for UnMuted and the conversations you'd like to have.
So let me say this. So one of the things that a lot of people in my profession send me messages a lot, and they're like, "Thank you so much for what you're doing for the profession." I'm like, yeah. And I think one of the reasons why they say that is that there are a lot of philosophers that they probably would not have heard of. And I try to balance it, right? That yes, we know the famous people, we know the tenured folks at Harvard. But what about these folks at a teaching university that have some wonderful things to say, right? And so one of the things I want to bring voice to them. And the kind of subline of the podcast is was professional philosophers talk about the social and political issues of our day. All right, so I've been very committed to that, but I've been tempted. So here are some of, let's just call them temptations.
Yes, I love it. Temptations. Divinity School, the temptations.
So here's, you know, they may not be as interesting as it may sound, but here are some temptations. So like I said earlier, that I'm a professional philosopher, but I'm not, you know, you are a philosopher. You know, if we've been thinking about philosophical problems, issues.
A philosopher, yeah.
Yes, children, but yeah, okay. Because that's going to contribute to what I'm about to say. If we all are about this philosophical enterprise, and I think that's what we are as human beings, whether we do it right, logically, is another thing, right? Mm-hmm. So what I've been interested in is what would it be like to have a season with young folk? Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about kids your son's age, right? Moving on up to high school. Mm-hmm. I think they have so wonderful questions. They have so many wonderful questions and so many insightful ideas, mm-hmm. right? Now, usually what we say is that, hey, all young people are they're born creative, right? Born with these imaginations, and they're born artists. And what happens is we teach their way out of artists. So I'm going to flip it and also say, I think young people we're born philosophers, mm-hmm. and we are educated out of that philosophical mindset. Mm-hmm. And so it will be wonderful to do a philosophy volume season with just young folk. Mm-hmm. So here's my boring answer. Then I'm also interested in, I'm really interested in the ways in which people that we never thought would even read philosophy. And I'm talking about really like popular folks that we're all familiar with. What have they read philosophically that impacted their work? Mm-hmm. Right? Because I think the seeds are there. Right? When I read their work, I'm like, oh, this sounds like such and such. Oh, I know they read this. Oh, I'm very interested on and some of the philosophical questions that kind of influenced, informed their other, you know, kind of disciplinary questions and answers. What are some people that they read that kind of informed this theory that we all talk about, but we don't make it synonymous or have seen any connections with philosophy? I'm very, very interested. Mm-hmm. And I'm not just talking about the political theorists, like talking to a political, that's too easy. Of course, they have engaged in philosophy, mm-hmm. but anthropologists. Right. So even thinking about your work, what's going on? There's some philosophy going on there. Mm-hmm. And who have you read perhaps to have, and what kind of if you could engage in a philosophical endeavor, what would be the next step? I'm very interested in that, because I see those connections. And I don't know if it's just the arrogance of me as a philosopher, where I think philosophy is any and everywhere. Mm-hmm. But I honestly think that it's a human enterprise. Mm-hmm. And I'm very interested in ways in which people engage this human enterprise that has nothing to do with their PhD proper or what they studied for 8 years in graduate school. Because I think it's there, and I think it'll be interesting to talk to them about that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Listen, you can already sign my son up. Internal IRB, just go ahead. He likes to get me in the car when I'm driving, and that's when he likes to hit me with the most, or bedtime, of course. I call him a bedtime philosopher. But some of the questions he asks, I mean, sometimes I have to say I need 2 or 3 minutes to go get there. You know, he asked me last week, why did the killers of Breonna Taylor only have to pay money, and the killers of George Floyd, why did they go to jail? And I was like, I need like minutes to just have a few sips of coffee, and then I will answer your question. So I think humans are meaning makers, and seeing children trying to figure out the world and where the pieces go is, I mean, it's an incredible thing to behold and witness, but to tell children that their questions have a place, that that the pursuit of asking questions is an enterprise, is an offering to children, right? Because I think that's the thing that we sometimes discipline out of them. Like, don't ask that. Why are you asking that question?
Right.
Well, you know, so not disciplining them from asking questions, getting that out of them.
Or we even answer, like, you know, I remember my mother always telling me, like, I asked her, why do I have to do something? And she'd say, because I said so. And, you know, Mom, first of all, you're committing a fallacy of authority. But I think that's a philosophical, that answer is kind of boring, but I think there's a philosophical, like what gives you, what's really being asked is what gives you the authority over me.
Right.
Oh, that's a political.
Yes.
Ooh, that's interesting. That's a political philosophy question.
Yes.
Aristotle had very different answers in which you would totally disagree. with.
I mean, I issue context too. Like sometimes I tell my son, like there are contexts in which I can do this, and there are contexts, particularly in relation to your safety, where me explaining my instruction might not be good for your well-being.
Right.
So us figuring out the when it's okay if we're at home chopping it up and whatever, but if we're out by the street, maybe me saying we should cross the street here now, and the why now, why here, maybe this isn't the place for that pursuit, you know. But I definitely think, you know, not disciplining the questioning, right? And what that means in terms of creating a citizenry, right? What if we understand our children as citizens, right? As rather than sort of these junior, you know, people that we're socializing, right? We're actually socializing, we're raising or in conversation with our future, right? So that I think it's vexing sometimes, but it's also very beautiful to see. There are a few questions in the chat. So I want to go to the first one, and I'll read it. So academics who work in social justice are usually accused of having uselessly high-level conversations with big words ending in isms. This is usually leveled at academic feminists and academics Marxist socialists. This is seen as useless at reaching ordinary people on the ground who they are trying to reach. How do you weigh in?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, in the back of the book, shout out to you, Dr. Thomas, I have a glossary section, and if I may, and I shout out Dr. Thomas because I audited her class when I was at Harvard, and one of the assignments that she gave students was very much having a glossary of terms. But I mentioned the chapter is called "Say What," a glossary of terms. And I basically, say academics have a way of speaking that can be confusing and perhaps some might say annoying. One of the biggest annoyances is the use of terms that only they seem to know the meaning of. But this use of specialized vocabulary is not restricted to academics. It is also used within activist circles and woke or conscious communities. In this interview, in this book, we've tried to explain concepts and terms as best we could. However, this doesn't mean that we did not fall into the trap of using specialized language with the assumption that everyone will understand what was meant, right? And there's a lot of posturing even within academia. I mean, to be sure, and I talk about this in the book, the next paragraph, there's people within sub-disciplines who just act like they know what another person is saying, and they have no idea what they're afraid to ask. I mean, so it happens in a very different way. So as opposed to thinking, oh, it's academic straight to the public, I think even within academic circles, we don't know what each other is saying. I mean, so this is for someone who, for the last year, I've been writing academic articles, take a break, go to a trade book, take a break, go to my crossover book, take a break, write this op-ed. And I must say, constantly going back in that transition, I've noticed, what have I found easier to write? And if you were asking me this 10 years ago, I would have said the public stuff. And I've come to realize that that's the most difficult stuff to write right now. So why is that the case? Because it seems to be that there are certain terms that are easier to say than they are to explain. So much so that sometimes we use, oh, you're gonna get me in trouble. Okay, so here's something that immediately come to mind. In philosophy, we have a tendency to say, what you just said, I have a worry about what you just said. I have a worry in response to your talk or in response to your argument. All right, so what does that mean? I really have to think about what I mean by that. Now, like right now, I really have to think. So it's not necessarily a concern. Is it a concern? It's not necessarily a concern. So I had to really think about, but it's so easy. Whatever all that is embodied in this particular term. But it's only something that philosophers, particularly analytic philosophers, say, right? So there's certain terms that just becomes kind of like easier way to say things, right? Just like slang becomes an easier way to say a thing. But here's the thing, you can get caught up in that you forget what that thing actually means. right? So I've been conscious throughout the book to the email that I was sent to interviewees is, listen, we're talking to a regular audience. Please explain your terms. And if you don't, I'm going to ask you to explain those particular terms. So it's a constant struggle. But I would say it's always the easy way out. So it's not the smartest thing. It's not the most genius thing to incorporate. To me, I'm starting to realize that it's the easiest thing to do. And we all know as writers, the easiest thing to do is not the most brilliant thing to do. Right. And so it's a constant challenge for us all to make things clear, to realize that it's not an indicator of your brilliance, that it's mostly habitual. And sometimes it's an obstacle to clarity. So it's a constant struggle. But I want to say that it's not just a struggle that academics face, but I think all woke and conscious folks with some kind of idea about their own intelligence rely on these, and that's the power of words, like language. That's what they do. But the constant struggle is to constantly make sure that you are communicating in a way that is accessible. It's a constant challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a book called Joyful Militancy that talks about the challenges of getting hung up on language and activist context, right? And I think the phenomena of cancel culture, right. within that context. So what are the ethics of engagement? Right. I don't know where we are in time, but there's one more question here. And I'm going to read it. Founding figures in anthropology were moral philosophers like Durkheim, who studied religion, in particular the social role of ritual. Can you talk more about the significance of religious and ritual context in your conversations, issues of truth, capital T, approaches to whatever one considers sacred, ideas of moral social obligation?
Oh, this is, I can't say everything to everything that was said. It's interesting. I don't know if you posed this question. I gave a talk at Harvard. I think it was this colloquium talk that I did on forgiveness and questions. I utilized the term ritual ignorantly as a philosopher, and people wanted me to say more. Like, I don't know, right? Because it's something that we're not consciously aware of within, and I can only really speak from analytic philosophy. I mean, I think, I can only really talk about kind of the ritual that I think I saw play out in these conversations. And we can talk about religion, which is quite interesting, right? So, one of the rituals, I started every other conversations that I have in the book with asking the philosophers, so how did you get interested in philosophy? So that's how every conversation begins. And that was a ritual of sorts. And out of that ritual, although that was something that I did with every conversation, no answer was the same. No answer was the same. I mean, they were all coming from very different perspectives. That was quite illuminating. And they also incorporated their own kind of histories and experiences within that answer. So that was a ritual of sorts. I mean, another ritual of sorts, I guess, if one can call it a ritual, is at the end, the way in which the conversation was organized is that I'll start with this question, but I'll also always end it with more of a personal question. So we talked about these issues. Now I want to get to know you as a person. And so I've always ended with the personal. Religion was interesting. I mean, there are conversations in this book that I probably would have been more cautious of incorporating if I wrote this book when I was a grad student in divinity school. I mean, there's like I said, there's a conversation on homosexuality. There's a conversation, depending on what religious tradition you're from, people may have a problem with that. There's a conversation on non-monogamy, depending on what religious tradition you're from, may have a problem with that. But that's one of the reasons why I like philosophy. There's no dogma. There's no restrictions or boundaries on the kinds of questions that I can have and the answers that that people can offer up. And so I felt a kind of freedom with that, in ways that I don't know if I was part of other traditions that I would have been able to address. Yeah,
thank you. We have a final question, and I'm going to read it verbatim. How do we have open conversations in society when many people no longer read books, academic articles, fact check, and in general refer to social media for their knowledge construction and diversity of thought?
Yeah. So then the question is, who is the we?
Mm-hmm.
And is the we a determined we?
Mm-hmm.
Or is the we a person of agency?
Mm-hmm.
And if that we is a person of agency, who can act in the world, who could indeed, even if it is the case that that is not happening, that one has the ability to go into an independent bookstore, to read a book, therefore one is responsible for that particular knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as that's in play, that we're not determined, that trends do not determine our intellectual honesty and our intellectual persistence, then the trends don't matter. Right. That we are moral agents that ought to put, I didn't mention this in the book, but intellectual virtues into practice. That no matter what is popular, we still have an obligation to the truth, whether it's a capital or lowercase, to be diligent, to be integral to that truth, mm-hmm. which requires reading and being charitable in our readings. And I would say that it's not just the case of people going online. I mean, you know, I got to talk to my students all the time. Did you read the work? Because you're paying for it. And I can detect when you don't read the work. And mm-hmm. you're not just, it's not even an issue of deception on behalf of us, but you're being dishonest to yourself.
Yeah.
And you're being irresponsible as a scholar for what you have signed up for.
Right.
So there will be no posturing in this class.
Mm-hmm.
That you're going to read, be charitable, be integral to yourself and to this process. And so I think the temptation goes back to temptation is it's not just happening online, but also happening in that classrooms. But it goes back to the issue of character. Who are we going to be?
Right.
Are we going to be intellectually virtuous? And that requires for us to do things that may not be popular.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to hold other people account to this intellectual integrity as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's expanding that list of virtues, right? Because in talking with you, I've heard stuff about translation, right? Like
mm-hmm.
who you're writing to, but you know, you're translating between these different audiences, but maybe we all have a responsibility regardless of our slang.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, you know, intellectual virtues, right? If
mm-hmm.
we have the ability, if the we has access, right? Then what are our responsibilities or obligations when it comes to interfacing with information, right?
Right. I mean, this made me think about, there's a lot of controversies in the publishing industry that's come out in the last couple of years. I must say, I really like, nerd controversies, to be honest. I don't think a lot of, you know, I'm just happy about that nerd drama to an extent
Mm-hmm.
of nerd drama. But I'm excited about nerd drama. So when American Dirt controversy came out, I was hearing everybody have a conversation online. Oh, this book is blah, blah, blah. This book is blah, blah, blah. Before I can say anything about the book, blah, 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 I bought the book.
Yeah.
Right. And I enjoy going to the bookstore and talking to my independent bookstore seller, Linda. I'm like, Linda, do you have American Dirt? And Linda was kind of ashamed. Right. She's like, yeah, I have it. I was like, I'll take it. I need to know what's happening.
Right.
I need to be an informed
right.
criticizer. And I think, you know, here's the thing, the lazy thing is to pick up on the riffs of other people. That's not only is it lazy, it's boring, it's unoriginal. And if you're not reading for yourself to have something to say about what's happening, because there's a lot of stuff that's happening, then you're boring and you're unoriginal. Not only goes back to kind of being lazy, but you're unoriginal. I mean, knowledge production. I mean, and the fruit of knowledge production comes out through hard work.
Mm-hmm.
And the beauty of that, whether I agree with you or disagree, the beauty that comes out of that is just a wonderful thing. So you're denying yourself something wonderful when you resort to that thing. And so yeah, I don't want anyone to think that's how I feel about movies. I don't care what you say about a movie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if it get 5 reviews, 5 stars. I need to see it for myself.
Right.
And that's how I feel about any kind of idea. And it's a topic that I know nothing about. I'm not saying what Kimberly Crenshaw said because I saw it in a tweet. I need to read the work myself because I have something unique to say to that issue, given that I read the work.
Right.
And it's not because I'm special, it's because we all are unique and have
Right.
different ways of thinking and bringing insight to the world. And I think we need to become obsessed with that uniqueness.
Right. It's beautiful.
Thank you both very much for this very important and provocative discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Krishna. Thank you. I enjoyed this. Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for this.
Thank you, Dr. Cherry. This is awesome.
So how can I get the velvet pillows in the back? I just want to know.
It's a G-spin quilt picture. Come on.
Okay.
Not
All right.
velvet pillows.
Okay. All right. I want it. Send me the JPEG.
Okay, I can text it to you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, taking your time out. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.